What's up, YouTube? Today I want to talk about creating Zenon records, Psytech / minimal style bass lines in Serum 2. So let's dive in and have a look. So I've done tutorials on this kind of bass sound in the past, and I've also done a couple of tutorials featuring a couple of the features that we're going to be using today. So I think this is an interesting way of kind of bringing a couple of those concepts together in a single sound. So I guess it's more constructive to you rather than all the theory behind some of the other tutorials. So anyway, today what I want to do is I kind of want to start with the subtone and kind of build up the frequencies from there. Reason being, with these kinds of bass sounds, it's really in that slow groove. And what I want to do is kind of create a few different layers of bass sound, all within Serum 2. And then we're going to kind of sidechain them differently to create a kind of groove. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about the sub and kind of aligning it nicely to the kick. So I've got a kick here, which I've made in kick 3. And I've got a bass, and I've got a MIDI here, which is kind of just long D-sharp notes on the kick, but then they take up a whole 1/4 of the bar. So just the default saw wave, it would sound something like this. Which is obviously not what we want, right? What we want to do is we want to create a kind of more side-chained pumping style bass sound. So what we can do is we can switch on the sub layer over here, we can turn down the level, and what I want to do is I want to create a couple of different LFOs, which are going to act like LFO tool or some kind of sidechain tool to modulate the levels of each of the layers in the bass sound, right? So the first thing that we want to do is we want to set these up so that it's configured how we want to. So let's set this to free, and it just makes sure that it's on 1/4, right? And so here, let's assign this to the level, and we can start kind of drawing in a pattern, something like this. So depending if you have a subwoofer or not, you may or may not hear this kind of really low frequency in this bass sound. So to just make sure that you can kind of hear the groove, you can actually turn the octave up. So do you hear what I'm doing with this kind of shape? What you want to try to do is kind of create a pattern which sounds nice and smooth, but has a bit of a groove to it. So I generally find with this subtone, you have quite a early start, somewhere around the quarter mark or just before, and quite a late. Something like that sounds pretty good. Okay, so let's turn the octave back down again. And now what I want to do is I just want to make sure that the phase is aligned in the kick and that subtone. So I'm going to use a thing called Oscillos Megascope, but there's several different tools that you can use for this exact task. So here, just to make sure, I'm going to turn up this volume over here so we can see this shape. And in fact, I'm going to just turn this curve up like this, just to make it more apparent where that crossover point is, right? So do you see how there's this kind of weird discontinuity in the waveform there? It's kind of going, and then there's like a half wobble, and then it starts going again. That's because these two frequencies are the same, but they have a slightly different phase. So it's a different starting point of the wave cycle. And what happens is they're kind of slightly canceling each other out for a few milliseconds, and that kind of creates this weird wobble. And with this kind of sound, with this kind of minimal kind of bass sound, you really want it to be like as smooth of a shape as possible. So we can either go into the kick and actually shorten the kick or widen the kick if we want to. But sometimes I find it's actually a bit more powerful to change the phase start point of the sine wave over here, because sometimes it can give you a slightly beneficial sound. So for example, if we're starting at like 90 degrees, sometimes you get a little bit of a transient, which can sound quite nice. I guess with this sound, there is no transient because we're morphing it in, so it doesn't actually matter, right? You want it to look like it's one continuous sine wave, right? So we can actually start this a little bit later and fiddle with this shape to kind of get that smooth shape in the waveform. It's so subtle, but like you can hear it just has this extra level of like tightness to it, right? So what I actually want to do is just turn this back to 0, and then we can undo and redo to kind of make sure we're heading in the right track. So obviously, depending on your listening setup, you know, on a laptop speaker or a cell phone speaker, you're definitely not going to be hearing this. But in a studio speaker, you can definitely hear that kind of like subtle difference. It's kind of a bit thunky like this. It goes do-woo, do-woo. But then when we've tuned it nicely, it's just do, do. Once we've tuned up the sublayer a little bit, then the rest of the sound is kind of just going to taste. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to employ a technique that I've spoken about in a previous video, where we're going to split up the saw wave into several different frequencies. So if you didn't know, you can actually edit this saw wave and change the different frequency balance here, kind of like an EQ. Each of these bars over here in this readout represents a one sine wave or a subtone. So removing this bar over here would essentially, using the combination of this and this, recreate that saw wave. So we can basically take the saw wave and split it up into 2 layers, one which is the sub and one which is just the sort of mid frequencies and higher, right? So we can kind of use bin 2 and 3 over here, and then right click over here and say clear bin 4 to end. And so now we've just isolated the very sort of bass and low mid frequencies over here. And then we can open up a new oscillator like this, and we can do the same thing, but we want to clear everything from the start to bin 3. So bin 4 and up is going to have sound in it. So let's just copy this and paste it over here. Okay, so complicated part is out the way. We want to just make sure that all of these random phases is on 0. And what we can do quickly is we can actually just disable these again. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to create an LFO that's like this. We can actually just hold Alt and drag this and copy it and paste it like that, and then do it again. So we want to create a kind of unique sidechain pattern for these mid frequencies and the higher frequencies, right? So let's turn the level down, put on LFO over here, and then we can use this as a kind of volume. And so now what we're doing is we're kind of like choosing, so the sub frequencies can kind of like scoop in much quicker. The bass and low mids can kind of scoop in a little bit longer. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use this kind of more higher frequencies to just add a little bit of kind of buzziness on top. But it's so subtle, like these, just changing this curve, changing this offset over here, really changes the groove in a big way. Okay, so let's jump to number 3 over here. Let's go like this. And then with this one, what I like to do is turn the levels down, assign LFOs like this, and then we're going to actually jump into the matrix over here and then assign a macro. Let's just go with like macro 5 over here. And then this is going to be the volume of the higher frequencies, just because we kind of want them to be the same And if we're adjusting it like this, there's actually a little trick I can show you. You see, because there's quite a big difference that we have here. So we really got to dial it in. And then once we've dialed it in, you can actually right click here and say apply and delete macro. And then what that does is it basically sets that amount and then removes the macro. Does that make sense? So it's really good for dialing in multiple things to the same value. So like if you have a kind of stereo thing here, which by the way, we're going to do here using the odd/even technique, which I described in a video not too long ago. So over here, we can actually go to the warp modes, and let's set up a odd on this side, and let's set up an even on this side, because this is also going to change how the volume balance is kind of applied, right? You see how just that small little adjustment of the curve can kind of throw that groove off a little bit. So really fine tune it. Okay, cool. So the reason that I split these odd and evens is so that we can have all the odd harmonics panned one side and all the even harmonics panned another side. So we can actually just set up a macro like this to pan. And in the previous tutorial, I jumped into the matrix and kind of set the one to negative and the one to positive. If you just set them like one all the way minus 100, one all the way plus 100, and you leave them bipolar, you can actually swap side to side, which is not a huge thing, but it's a bit easier to set up than the whole, like, you know, jumping in there, adjusting it, and do you know what I mean? Okay, cool. That's sounding good. So with these kind of bass sounds, the filter is less of a essential thing and more just like an aesthetic addition. So for example, we don't need it too much because we've kind of created this thing which offsets the frequencies like that. It kind of sounds like there's some kind of filtering happening, right? So the filter is not essential, but like it would be in a traditional Psytrance bassline. But it's nice to kind of add to these sort of buzzy top frequency layers just to tune them up a little bit, or maybe give them a bit of resonance, or turn down the brightness a little bit on them, you know. So I'm going to add a filter, and we're going to adjust it so that we're going to turn off A and turn on B and C. We can turn down the resonance. We can adjust that a little bit later if we want to. And for these kinds of things, I found MG Dirty, one of the new Serum 2 filters, sounds really, really good. And then here we can actually set up a last LFO that can modulate that cutoff. Okay, so let's apply and delete macro. And so it then removes it as that sidechain there for B and C, but just adjusts the amount accordingly, which is really, really cool. We can also set up a thing where these send direct to the outputs, like this, so that we can have certain effects on just the top layer, or we can have effects, saturation and stuff on the lower mids, and like a reverb or something on these top layers as well, using the split buses over here. What I want to do is send this to bus 1 and then press none over here, so that it's just going to send to bus 1, and then we're going to put some saturation on here and then send it to the direct output. And then with this one, B and C, we're going to send it to bus 2, and it's then still going to go to the filter. In fact, we're actually going to go from the filter to bus 2. That would be better. So here on bus 1, let's give it a bit of distortion. Let's set soft clip. So we can kind of saturate just this layer without adding any effects to this layer or these layers, which is kind of really, really cool to be able to do that just kind of directly inside Serum nowadays, you know. Then what we can do is we can add a little bit of reverb to that top layer. Maybe just like really, really short reverb, just to create a bit of roomy space. So we can also put a EQ afterwards to remove some of these lows. And then we can just use this send as an amount. Oh yeah, one last thing. So Serum 2 has MPE capabilities, which means if we want to do cool pitch bends and stuff like that, it's actually really, really easy. All we need to do in Bitwig, at least, is set up MPE over here. And then we have access to bending the notes with Bitwig's kind of MPE thing. So we can kind of bend up and down, which is really, really nice. Cool. Okay, that's about it. You can go various ways using this sort of technique. You don't necessarily have to do those kind of sidechain type patterns. But if you want to know more about the whole splitting process, why it's really cool and stuff, I have done a couple of tutorials over the past couple of months, I guess now. I'm going to try and remember to post all of the links to those in the description so you can kind of do a bit more nerding out if you want to. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to support me, the best way to do so is either heading over to Patreon or checking out some of the stuff that I have on my store for sale. The links to that will be in the description as well. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'm actually going to be uploading this preset to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. So yeah, if you want to grab this exact preset and just kind of fiddle with it from there, then check out my Patreon. So yeah, okay, that's it. See you guys next time. Cheers.